I was working at a hotel in Albuquerque. I was on the graveyard shift, and I had been talking to the security guard a bit. He asked me if he could get a ride home, so instead of waiting for 30 minutes for my shift to end, I just left and left a note for my boss that said I'd left early because my brother was stranded outside of town and needed me to pick him up. It was a total lie on my part, of course, but I needed a good excuse to leave early. I dropped off the security guard at his place, then went home and went to sleep. After a couple of hours of sleep, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was my brother. He told me he really was stranded outside of town, and he needed me to pick him up right now. I told my brother the lie I'd told my boss, and how much of a coincidence it was that he was calling me and saying this. He said that wasn't the weird part, though. He said he'd show me what was weird when I got there. When I got there, I asked him what he was talking about. He put his phone up to my ear and played a message he'd received when he woke up that morning. It was a voice that sounded kind of roboticized. It was creepy as hell. The voice message just kept saying, "You're stuck, you're stuck, you're stuck," over and over. It freaked us both out. We never figured out where the call came from. It's the strangest and creepiest thing that's ever happened to me in my entire life. When I was little, I would go over to my grandparents' house frequently with my sister and my cousins. My grandparents have an attached mother-in-law apartment, so we always played in there while the grown-ups would talk in the main house. One day, we were playing hot and cold with a little key we'd found in the apartment. One person was hiding it when they accidentally dropped it, and it fell under the door to the basement. I opened the door to go inside and retrieve it, only to find that when I did so, there was a man standing at the bottom of the stairs. I didn't recognize him at all. When the man saw me, he screamed at me to close the door. I was so freaked out I slammed it behind me and bolted upstairs immediately. I ran into the main house to tell my parents. My dad went into the basement to look around, but he couldn't find anyone. To this day, they all tell me that I imagined it, but my sister and cousins insist it was real. Well, about 5 years later, both my grandparents unfortunately passed away. Because of this, I was helping my dad clean out their basement. It turns out they were actually missing a lot of stuff down there that was supposed to be there. I haven't gone back down there or to that house ever since. When I was in 8th grade, my parents separated. Basically, my mom packed her and I up one night, and we moved into my grandparents' home. We didn't look back. We ended up living there throughout my high school years. When he died, my parents officially got divorced. My mom remarried, and we moved into the city with my stepfather. My grandpa lived on the first floor of the apartment, and the owners, an elderly couple who were family to us through marriage, lived on the second floor. The property also had a small in-law cottage out in the back. That was where my uncle lived. For some reason that I'll never understand, there was no lock to get into the actual building if you entered through the back. The back door just opened right into a landing, where there was a locked and deadbolted door right to our apartment. Then 2 sets of stairs. One led up to the also locked and deadbolted door of the second floor apartment, and the other led down to the basement. There was also no lock on our front apartment door. It could just be entered from the front of the building. In order to access the second floor apartment or the basement, though, you had to go through this landing. The basement was actually pretty nice, and at one point they had started to convert it into its own apartment before they ultimately decided to make the in-law cottage instead. That meant the basement was right there, with a full kitchen, complete with an oven, sink, and refrigerator. There was a washer and dryer, which was shared by all of us who lived there. That was also in the basement. There were some general storage stuff down there too. It was entirely open except for a back room that was full of more storage. That room had one of those swinging saloon-type doors where you could see above and below them. The storage area was longer than it was deep, so you couldn't really see that much behind the doors though, aside from all the shelves in there. You had to walk in and then turn to really observe the room. One night when I was in high school, I think I was around 15 at the time. After taking a shower, I saw the laundry bin in the bathroom was pretty full, so I grabbed a ton of laundry and headed down toward the basement. It was pretty late at night, but I figured I would at least get it started and move some things over in the morning. I tossed everything onto the ground and started sorting out the colors. That was when I got hit by this horrible feeling in my gut. The basement was not all that creepy at all. It was well lit and pretty welcoming, with the kitchen and everything in there. For some reason I can't explain though, something just started to feel wrong to me. Anyone who's ever been hit with the feeling they were being watched knows exactly what I'm talking about. I didn't know how or why, but that feeling just rushed over me. It was something I couldn't shake no matter what either. I found myself glancing over to the saloon doors, the only part of the basement I couldn't see in its entirety. I don't know why, maybe just to assure myself I was being a big baby. I started to walk toward that back room. I stopped myself just as I reached out toward the swinging doors. I've been a horror fan for as long as I can remember, and I'd seen more horror movies than I could possibly count. I knew that if this was a movie, I'd be calling myself a dumbass and saying not to go into that room. I quickly snatched my hand back and ran up the stairs, leaving all the clothes behind me. I ran into our apartment, where I locked the doors that could lock, and immediately told my mom about the feeling in the basement. I was super creeped out, despite me not being that type of person. She basically rolled her eyes at me and told me to go to bed. I ended up doing as I was told, though it took me quite a bit to shake that feeling and finally fall asleep. Later that night, my bladder woke me up, and I stumbled out of my room to go to the bathroom. I didn't turn on any of the lights as I started making my way toward the bathroom. Usually that would wake up my grandpa, and I didn't really want to bother him. When I got closer to the bathroom, I noticed my mom standing in the doorway of her bedroom. Something looked off to me. It took me a moment to realize that she was clutching her phone. When she noticed me, she whispered to me to get against the wall, which I did without hesitation. It took a few moments for the grogginess to wear off and for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. As they did, I began to see what she did. My mom's bedroom was immediately off the kitchen. The kitchen was where the back door that led to the landing and basement was located. The door had a tiny window up top with a small but thick curtain. It was thin enough though that you could see that someone was outside the door, thick enough to not be able to make out any of their features. There was someone definitely there. Every now and then the doorknob would turn and you could hear a scratching sound on the other side. I'd never been so afraid in my entire life. I'm not sure how I managed to do what I did next. It was like someone else took control over me. I slid down against the wall I was clinging to and crawled against it toward the darkness. I crawled into the kitchen. My mom looked terrified, watching back and forth between me and the back door. She kept whispering for me to stop and go back, but I kept moving forward. I reached the counter, where I grabbed up a butcher knife. I was shaking the whole time. I moved with knife in hand on the ground next to the fridge, which was next to the door as well. The man was still trying to get in. I had this horrible feeling something bad was going to happen. I wasn't going to go down without a fight though. I stood there next to the door with a knife in hand, my mom hiding in the bedroom doorway across from me. It was only for a few minutes though. My mom had already called 911 before I'd even woken up and stumbled my way toward the bathroom. Lights from approaching squad cars soon filled the kitchen, and from the other side of the door I could hear a sudden clamoring and commotion. There was a slam of the back screen bursting open as the would-be assailant took off running. It was around 3 a.m. or so. That meant it was completely dark outside. We lived right next to some train tracks and very thick bushes and trees, which made it very easy for the man to escape. The police came in and took statements from my mom and I. My grandpa, who was partially deaf, had managed to sleep through most of the entire thing. That was until the police came inside to search through the apartment and make sure we were okay. The outside door and the doorknob were both covered in deep scratches, like someone had been going at it with a knife trying to figure out how to get in. That wasn't the most horrifying part to me. That was reserved for the basement. The clothes I had brought down there were not where I had left them. They had been thrown about and shoveled into the back room. The one with those swinging doors I had stopped myself from going into. The boxes that were out of view had been thrown about, all opened and obviously gone through. There were some things missing, and there were wrappers from food on the floor. He had been down there looking for something to steal. Apparently he was down there when I went down to do the laundry. I had almost walked right into that room with him. Based on what we had seen from the door, he had a knife with him. To this day, I can't help but find myself sometimes thinking about what would have happened had I walked into that room. I've never shared this story with anyone outside my immediate family. It may sound insane, but I promise this is the truth. When I was 15, my parents and I moved to a newly constructed housing development in Beltsville, Maryland. We lived right on the end of a cul-de-sac, but our house was the only one that was completed so far. Granted, our lot was just one giant patch of dirt so far, but we didn't really mind. We loved the experience of living in a brand new house in a quiet corner of the neighborhood. All the other houses around us still needed the finishing touches put on, such as windows and siding. Because of this, none of them were occupied. During the day, there were contractors all over the other properties, hard at work finishing building them. At night, though, it was peace and quiet. My parents and I would take long walks around the area and sneak peeks at the inside of the other empty houses. About a week after we moved in, I woke up at around 2 a.m. It was from an awful pain in my foot that turned out to be an ingrown toenail. I didn't know that at the time, though. I limped downstairs trying to find my Game Boy. I figured if I was going to be stuck awake and miserable, I might as well play some Pokemon Blue to make the time pass faster. I didn't turn on any lights in my downstairs, though. I found the Game Boy on the coffee table by the light of the street lamps outside. I walked back past the front door to head back upstairs when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I paused next to our front door. We had a long window that gave us a perfect view of our porch outside and the driveway beyond. My mom had intended to put up a curtain, but she hadn't gotten around to it yet. I stopped in my tracks and turned to look outside. After squinting for a few moments, my heart began to hammer inside my chest. I'm sure my eyes went as big as stop signs. In the dark, it was hard to tell for sure. The only light I had to judge was a street lamp at the end of the driveway, but it looked like there was a figure of a man standing with his back to me, literally just off our porch, as if he had just stepped off of it right then. He seemed to be staring in the direction of an empty house across the street. That was scary enough, but what terrified me even more was how dead still he was standing. He wasn't shifting his weight or fidgeting in any way. I blinked hard and tried to tell myself I was just seeing things. Maybe this was a shadow or just my imagination. When I opened them again, though, I realized I was not crazy. This figure definitely was there. I should have cautiously made my way back upstairs and woken up my parents, but instead I did something very stupid. I'm not sure why I did this. I guess some part of me just wanted to try and make out if he was even breathing. I moved closer to the window and practically pressed my face to the glass. That's when the figure must have either heard me or felt my eyes upon him. His head spun around to face me. Not his upper body either. He just turned only his head, jerking it violently around to look over his shoulder. He almost looked like an animal in that moment. I saw 2 pale pinpricks of light staring directly back at me, and I knew those were his eyes. I launched myself away from the window and screamed for my parents. I practically flew up the stairs and started wailing that there was a man on the front porch. My parents don't believe in guns, so when my dad saw the terror on my face, he grabbed the closest heavy object within reach, which happened to be metal tubing from the vacuum cleaner. He then made his way down the stairs. I threw myself into my mom's arms, and I heard my dad cursing and hollering. Then there was a moment of silence. We heard my dad drop the pipe, and then he called upstairs to my mom. His voice was desperate and terrified. He told us to call the cops right now. My dad is a big guy, 6'4", and at the time easily 250 pounds. Back when I was just a baby, he even used to work part-time as a bouncer. But in this moment, he sounded terrified in a way I'd never thought was possible for him. There came a hard pounding from outside the front door. I hid in my parents' closet while my mom called the cops. My dad was halfway up the stairs, yelling at this guy to just leave and that the police were already on their way. After what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 3, the pounding stopped. The police arrived 10 minutes after that and searched the entire property and the surrounding houses, but they couldn't find any signs of the man. I stayed upstairs while my mom and dad spoke to the officers in the driveway. The police did routine drive-bys for the next several nights, but as far as I know, they never found the man. I didn't get a good night's sleep for weeks after. I just kept remembering how the man's head had snapped around to face me, his pale eyes burning themselves into my mind. It was several weeks later when my dad finally told me what scared him so much. When he had reached the bottom of the stairs, the man had his face pressed up against the window. There was a knife in between his teeth. My dad dropped the vacuum pipe when he saw the man push the tip of his knife through his own cheek. The man then started using his blood to trace outside the window with his finger. After the police arrived, they found the streaks of blood all around the siding of our house, as if he had encircled it, continuing to run his bloody fingers across the outer walls. My family never took walks at night again, even after the other houses were eventually occupied, and to this day I never peek out through the curtains at night, for fear I might see those eyes again. My story takes place in Lancaster, Florida, back in 2007. I was 18 at the time, a senior in high school. I had picked up a job as a sign waver. You know, those people who stand outside on street corners waving promotional signs around for businesses. Yeah, it sucks just about as much as you might think it does, but as a high school student, it paid fairly well. By the way, please stop throwing things at us from your cars while we're out waving our signs. It's just not cool. The job is demeaning enough without having fast food launched at our heads. Anyway, I had been standing on my corner for about 2 hours swinging my sign around, waving at passing drivers. That was when I noticed a bald guy sitting across the street from me on a bench, looking my way. I waved to him more or less just to keep the rhythm going. He immediately gave me the finger. It wasn't just a casual flip off either. He raised his entire fist like he wanted to hit me and started shouting at me from across the intersection. I couldn't make out exactly what he was saying, but I could hear a few cuss words definitely being used a few times. I avoided eye contact with him and focused my attention back on the cars again. Soon after, my boss pulled up to the curb and told me that I was free to leave. Our company had gotten laid off, and all the sign wavers were going to be replaced by a different team. I was disappointed I would be out of work for the foreseeable future, but in that moment I was just relieved to be able to sit down somewhere out of the sun. I was about to tell my boss about that bald guy when I noticed the bench across the street was now empty. I wasn't exactly sure when he'd left. but I simply shrugged it off and got into the car with my boss, who told me my replacement was going to be there within an hour. Over the course of the next hour, I went home, got changed, and was meeting a friend for lunch before going to see a movie. That was when notifications on my phone started exploding non-stop, with people asking if I was alright and telling me to call them right away. Needless to say, I was very confused. I immediately called my mom, who burst into tears when she heard my voice. I went home to be with her, and immediately found out what all this concern had been about. The news was reporting that a sign waver had just been shot and killed on the very corner I'd been standing on less than an hour ago. When the victim had fallen, the sign had covered his face. He didn't have any identification on him, so most of my friends had jumped to the horrible conclusion that I was the one lying there dead on the sidewalk. The creepiest thing was, the victim looked very similar to me. We were both Latino with short dark hair, about the same height, and were even wearing identical outfits. I was eventually interviewed by the police, and I mentioned that bald man who'd been shouting angrily at me from across the street. To the best of my knowledge, though, they concluded the shooting was gang-related. Either way, the situation really shook me, and I didn't feel safe or relaxed for a long while afterwards. I felt terrible the other guy had died, but at the same time, had my boss not come when he did and picked me up, who knows if it would have been me that was shot and killed. I have a wife and child now, and sometimes when I look at them, I think about how different everything could have been if I was the one there that day. I'm 17, and I live in the city of Estonia in Europe. English is not my first language, so I apologize for any mistakes. It was around 2 p.m. or so, and I had just finished another boring school day. I had guitar lessons on Wednesday after school. I considered skipping the lesson and going straight back home, lying to my parents that the teacher had been sick and there was no lesson today. I decided to simply man up and go to class anyway, though. That turned out to be a big mistake, ironically enough. I got to the entrance of the building when I spotted a weird man wearing a red hooded jacket, sitting cross-legged in a puddle right in the middle of the parking lot. I stopped and stared at him for a minute in confused fascination. He didn't seem to be moving at all. It had rained the night before, and there were dozens of small puddles scattered around the parked cars. It looked like he had intentionally gone out of his way to find the largest one in the lot to occupy. Multiple other people were giving him sideways glances as they entered the building, but no one was really saying anything. Eventually, I just shrugged it off and made my way to my lesson. After 2.5 hours of sitting in the classroom, I had completely forgotten about the man. As I left the building, though, I noticed to my surprise that the man was still sitting there. He hadn't moved a single muscle. I was very creeped out, and I did something very stupid. I walked over to him, and once I got within 10 feet, I pulled out my phone and like a smartass, I said, "Hey man, don't move." I took a photo of him. I've since lost the photo because I had to change phones. After I took a picture of the guy, his eyes instantly shot up to make contact with mine. My heart skipped a beat. His head didn't move at all, just his eyes. The man's skin was extremely wrinkled and weather-beaten. His eyes were gray, and he had an incredibly long beard. He smelled like he'd been living in a heap of garbage. The look in his eyes sent a chill up my spine. It was almost like he wasn't even human. I took off at a brisk walk toward the sidewalk, not letting myself look any further. I crossed the street and stopped at the opposite crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. My guitar case was feeling twice as heavy as it usually did. I glanced back toward the parking lot, and my heart immediately sank. The Puddle Man had stood up and was now walking directly toward me. His eyes were staring at me with an intense hatred. He didn't even bother to look both ways before crossing the street. I immediately called out an apology to him again and again, but his expression didn't change at all. It was then that I noticed his clothes were soaking wet from sitting in the puddle, but it wasn't just a trail of water he was leaving behind. He was bleeding heavily from both hands, or possibly his wrists. It was hard to tell. He was leaving dark red pools on the concrete as he continued toward me. I immediately dashed across the crosswalk without waiting for the light to change. In retrospect, I'm actually pretty lucky I didn't get hit by a car. I started running as fast as I could down the sidewalk without looking back. I know I probably should have just called the cops, but I was panicking and holding my guitar case with both hands. I didn't want to free one of my hands to use my phone for fear my case might slow me down. Every so often I glanced behind me and noticed the man was still chasing me with long, determined strides. After about 5 minutes of running, I felt like I was going to collapse. I still had another half-mile to go though before I reached my apartment building, and the Puddle Man was closing in on me. Knowing I was going to regret this later, I ditched my case on the sidewalk and sprinted forward down the dark street. I didn't look back once I got into my building. I ran up the stairs and down the hall and ducked into my apartment, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and started gasping for air like I'd nearly drowned. My mother yelled at me from the kitchen for making so much noise. She asked me if I was okay, and I just nodded without responding. I don't know why I didn't tell her what happened. Probably because she wouldn't even have believed me. Surely she would have just screamed at me for abandoning my guitar and would have made me go back to retrieve it. I simply told her I'd left it at school overnight and locked myself in my room until I was finally able to relax. The following morning, I woke up at 6 to walk the dog and get ready for school. This is the part I'm not sure people are going to believe. I promise you it's the truth though. When I opened my apartment door, I gasped and my legs nearly gave out beneath me. My guitar case was sitting right outside with dried and crusted blood all over the handle. That was terrifying enough, but what freaked me out even more was the outside doorknob was covered in blood as well. My guitar case doesn't have a tag or anything on it with my name or address. I have absolutely no idea how he found out where I lived. I immediately washed the blood off the knob and the handle, and I never told anyone. Not the school, not the police, and definitely not my parents either. I stopped going to my guitar lessons after that. I haven't seen the Puddle Man since then, but sometimes I lie awake at night and fear knowing that he knows where I live. He's already tried to get in once. Thank God I remembered to lock the door that night. "4 years ago, I was finally able to move to a big city, one I had wanted to live in all my life. I had just turned 23. I had a well-paying job and many of my friends already lived there. I rented out a shabby studio apartment and got myself a cat as well. I was absolutely in love with the city for a while. It all started at a punk show in an unkempt dive bar. You know what I'm talking about. And doodles on the walls, sticker toilets, my natural habitat. I had been drinking quite heavily and got very sociable. I made the rounds to greet my group of friends and got some free birthday beers to boot. All in all, I was having a pretty great time. I stood right at the stage for most of the show because the band was genuinely amazing. Because of this, it took me a while to notice the tall skinhead guy standing about 5 feet from me. When I say tall, he was very tall. Not fat or skinny at all either. I think broad would be the right word to describe him. He had a shaven head, boots, braces, all that decor. I didn't pay much attention to him as I was too focused on the band playing. During cigarette breaks and while watching the band, I noticed he was sort of nearby me always. I assumed he must be socializing with common friends or something. At one point, I was standing in front of the stage, and a mosh pit had formed behind me. He was in it, and whenever he circled back around behind me, he would sort of attempt to grab me into it. I didn't really want to join though. I was wasted, and I knew I would get hurt if I did. The show ended and everyone was saying their goodbyes when I realized somehow I'd lost my bus pass. It was too far to walk home, and none of my friends would let me crash over at their place. I was in the middle of begging all my friends for a ride or at least bus money when the skinhead approached me. He offered to drive me home, even though he was clearly intoxicated. I knew I shouldn't ride with a drunk driver, but I was drunk too and it was raining, and I'd never made the best decisions anyway. While in the car, I got a better look at the man's face. He certainly wasn't ugly, but it looked like he could pass for about 40 or so. He drove surprisingly well for a drunkard and got me home safe. At the apartments, he asked if he could hang out inside. I told him no because my cat didn't like strangers. He seemed fine with that and told me good night. He left soon after. Exactly 1 week later, I discovered flowers at my front door. There was no indication of who had sent them, but I hate flowers, so I threw them away. A few weeks later, he called me up. Apparently, he'd gotten my phone number somehow. He asked me if I wanted to go to dinner that weekend. I was really creeped out by this, obviously. I wasn't used to men just calling me up randomly and hitting on me, nor them being so direct. I declined, saying I had to work that weekend, which was not true. That weekend, I went to a house show instead. There were no other skinheads attending the show, so I thought he wouldn't be there. Of course he was, though. I avoided him for most of the night and did my best to have a good time regardless. I started to realize that technically this guy had done nothing wrong. In fact, he'd been quite helpful to me. Maybe he just had a crush on me. Why was I being so cold to him and getting creeped out for no reason? I decided to let go of my preconceptions and say hello to him. Be a little bit friendly. He acted friendly back and we shared some whiskey and chatted. At one point, he put his arm around my waist and people teased us for looking so sappy. Around 3 a.m. or so, the party died down, and everyone either left or passed out around the house. I was outside smoking on the front curb when he came out and bummed a smoke off me. He started to get really angry with me out of nowhere. Started going off on me for lying about having to work that day and refusing dinner. He accused me of being a tease. His outburst was so sudden and unprovoked, he caught me off guard. He'd been so nice just seconds ago. I tried to tell him I'd taken the day off, but he didn't believe me. He asked me if I liked him. At this point, I was starting to realize he was kind of unhinged. I told him I did. Now, keep in mind I was drunk, and I said this attempting to avoid a physical confrontation. That turned out to be a terrible mistake. He gripped my arm fiercely and started dragging me towards his car. He said if I really liked him, I would go to his car, let him take me away, and fuck him all night. I tried pulling away and yelled something like, "Leave me the fuck alone!" When I turned around to go back inside, he grabbed the back of my hair and slammed me to the ground. My head hit the pavement real hard. I couldn't comprehend anything for a while. He was above me yelling, but I couldn't understand anything he was saying. I only remember lying there, not able to move or say anything, with a pounding in my head. Apparently, I had been screaming loud enough to wake most of the people in the house, though. They told me they ran outside to see what all the commotion was about and saw me lying in the road screaming and bleeding. He was pounding my head against the pavement. I have no recollection of that fierce beating. They chased him off. After he got in his car and drove away, they took me to the hospital, where I had to get multiple stitches. I had a broken nose and a concussion. I was released 2 days later, when they confirmed that I was fine now. I learned more about this guy from my friends. Apparently, he had been telling people we hooked up that night he gave me a ride home, and that led people to believe we were seeing each other since then. His roommates told me he would often leave, claiming he was hanging out at my place, and return early in the mornings. As far as I know, he never did show up at my house, though. It's possible he stalked the place at night. The same roommates of his assured me they would take care of him from then on. He jumped states soon after. He hasn't tried contacting me again since. It took me months to heal fully physically, and I've become very paranoid and untrusting towards nearly everyone. I've lost many friends because of what happened. A lot of people didn't seem to believe me, except for the ones who directly helped me out that night. The guy's roommates practically ran him out of the whole state. They become very close friends of mine and helped me get through this ordeal. I don't live in the city anymore. I do really miss it sometimes, but I feel much safer in my small town. When I was a kid, my dad and I moved in with my grandparents for a while. My grandparents' house was very large and out in the middle of nowhere. The entire house was built out of wood and sheetrock, so the outside was a dark wooden color. So were the rest of the areas that hadn't been covered with sheetrock as a design quirk. Everything was always creaking, as the house was very old. Every single decoration my grandparents owned looked like it belonged in a museum. My room was in the basement, which in this house wasn't completely below ground. The windows in my bedroom faced out into the open backyard. Like I said, this house was in the middle of nowhere, so when it got dark, it got real dark. There were trees surrounding the house on all sides. The driveway wasn't even a straight path. It curved through the surrounding forest before meeting up with the main road. I was home alone quite frequently, as my dad worked and my grandparents liked to go out. So, without even having any pets in the house, that meant I was left alone quite often, and I was isolated because of it. I was probably the only person around for miles and miles. My bedroom in the basement happened to share a wall with the laundry room. The laundry room was only accessible if you walked out of my room, up the stairs, toward the front door, then turned right and went down a second set of stairs. Down there was another basement-type area, but it wasn't connected to my section of the basement, if that makes sense. I know it's a pretty weird design. That section of the basement also had a side door that opened up to the side of an attached shed. A lot of times when my dad came home, he'd forget to lock the door behind him. It was kind of a door in the middle of a hallway, really, if you count the shed. Anyway, despite the laundry room being literally right there, it was an extremely long walk from my bedroom to there. Whenever people would do laundry, I would hear them climbing up the creaky steps and slamming the door of the dryer, and all those mechanical sounds as well. One day, I was home alone after school, as usual. I was sitting on the couch drawing, when I heard someone knock on the front door. I peered out the window to see who was standing there. Me being 15, I thought I was old enough to be an adult. I got up and went to the door. The door had this large glass window on either side of it, so I could easily see who was outside. There was a man standing there. He was a Caucasian male with a large beard. He had brown, messy hair and was dressed in flannel and overalls. He literally looked like a stereotypical lumberjack. Thanks to the windows, I could see him easily, as could he see me. I was about to open the door and ask what he wanted, but he stepped up to the windows and stared inside so quickly that I froze and stood there. I could see he was excited, almost like he was expecting something. It was then that I decided not to open the door after all. Hello? I called out hesitantly. He greeted me in a voice that was way too loud. Is Mary home? Mary was my grandmother's name, but most people who knew her well called her Mary Lou. I stared through the glass, not knowing what to say. I think I got some of her mail by accident. Could she come to the door so I could talk to her for a moment? They're not home right now, I replied stupidly. The man smiled and looked into my eyes. They left a pretty young thing like you home all alone? I didn't say anything for a moment, then pointed to the bench on the porch. If you want, you can leave the mail on the bench. I'll let them know you stopped by. The man stared back at me. He seemed quite off-put by this, but finally nodded okay. He told me to have a good day. I found out later it was only a piece of junk mail he'd left there. I told my parents about the man when they got home, and they told me they had no idea who it could have been. A few weeks passed by, and I had pretty much forgotten all about that man. Aside from drawing, one of my hobbies was polishing long branches I found in the forest. I would make these kind of staves out of them. I would spend a lot of time in the woods, listening to music and twirling my staves in my hands, teaching myself how to toss and catch them like batons. I got pretty damn good at it after a while. One day, while I was outside doing this, that same man approached me out of nowhere. He had crossed our backyard and walked right up to me. I had my headphones in, so I didn't hear him coming at all. I nearly screamed when I turned around and saw him standing there beside me, practically within arm's reach. He greeted me in a voice that was way too loud again and reminded me he was my neighbor. He'd seen me from his section of the woods and wanted to ask me about my staves. I pretty much just shut him down and refused to answer any of his questions with anything more than shrugs and grunts. What was really bothering me, though, was that I knew there was no place in eyeshot he could have possibly seen me from, at least not from another property. The nearest house was several miles away. I made an excuse about having to go back inside. I went in through the shed entrance, which in hindsight was a really stupid thing to do. From back inside the house, I watched him saunter off into the woods. I didn't even feel bad for blowing him off. This guy had no business walking into our section of the woods and approaching a teenage girl who was by herself. Several weeks later, I was home alone again. I was drawing on my computer in my room when I heard the bottom stairs creak from the other side of the wall where the laundry room was. I froze, wondering who this could possibly be. I hadn't heard the front door open upstairs, and it was too early for my dad to be home. Starting to panic, I left my room and hid in a storage closet under my section of stairs. I used my phone as a light and crammed myself in between two boxes. I pressed myself down as far as I could. I was horrified to hear the laundry room steps continue to creak, even though I was in the next room over. Something in my gut told me this couldn't be anyone I knew. Why would they be climbing the stairs so slowly and carefully? I waited, holding my breath, as I could hear the ceiling above me creak. The footsteps backtracked, as if the intruder was trying to figure out the strange layout of this home. I heard the stairs above me begin to creak. I panicked, as I realized whoever this was had just found their way into my section of the basement. I heard the footsteps suddenly quicken, and the door was thrown open, then shut. A few minutes later, I heard my grandparents walk inside. The man had pretended to wait at the front door for them. My grandparents hadn't even noticed the front door was unlocked. I cautiously came out of the storage area and stood at the base of the stairs, mostly hidden behind the corner. I was peeking out to see what was going on. Apparently, the man saw me because he waved and grinned at me like he was my friendly uncle. I did not wave back, though. He was acting friendly and confident. Not at all like a man who was almost just caught for breaking and entering. We moved a short while later, and thankfully, my grandparents have never heard from him since. I was in 5th grade when this happened. My brother is 3 years older than me, so he was in 8th grade at the time. I'm 24 now and he's 27. We lived on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees. My grandparents' house was 30 feet across from the yard. My dad's job used to require him to work 12-hour shifts. This incident happened when he was working from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. At the time, it was only me, my brother, and my mother at home. My grandparents were at home across the yard as well. It was probably around 9 p.m. or so, and we were sitting in the living room watching some TV before heading to bed. From the living room window, you could see my grandparents' house clearly, as well as the dirt road behind it. That meant you could see a car's upcoming headlights long before you could see the actual car itself. While watching TV, I happened to turn my head and noticed headlights coming down the road. As the car came into view, I noticed it began to slow down. I expected my fears to be alleviated when I saw the car continue to roll past the house, but it didn't do that. The headlights just barely managed to shine past the corner, so I could tell the car had come to a complete stop out front. I told my brother and my mother what was happening, and they came to the window to witness it themselves. My mom told us not to panic. Maybe it was somebody needing directions. Of course, I didn't think this at the time, but what person drives down a random dirt road if they're needing directions at this time of night? We all waited at the window for what seemed like the longest few minutes of my life. My imagination was going wild with all the horrible scenarios my grandparents were possibly facing. Finally, the car came into view past my grandparents' house, and within a few seconds had disappeared down the road. About a minute later, our house phone rang. My mother picked it up. It was my grandmother on the other end. She said a random truck had stopped in front of their house, and a shirtless man had knocked on their front door. My grandmother, who had answered the door, called my grandfather over to her and asked the man if they could do something for him. The man said that he needed my grandfather to give him a ride somewhere up the road. This request was extremely odd because there was obviously someone else still sitting in the driver's seat of the truck. My grandfather declined his request because of there already being somebody with the man. He couldn't imagine why this man would need a ride, especially from him. There was a screen door separating them. After my grandfather declined his request, he became visibly angry and started yelling while beating on the steel part of the screen door. My grandparents closed the heavier wooden door in front of the man's face and watched him from the window. The man ran back to the truck, and they left after. After my mother had gotten off the phone, she called my dad and explained everything to him. Being that he works a good hour and 10 minutes away, and the fact nobody had been threatened with a weapon or anything, he just told my mom to call the cops and have them check out the woods around the houses, just to be sure the man and his companion weren't trying to stake us out or something. We knew a cop that went to the same church as us. He came shortly and brought another policeman with him. They drove both of their patrol cars up the tree line and shined their huge spotlights out into the woods. After he and the other cop had done a thorough sweep of the property, they reported they'd found nothing suspicious and told us to call them if we heard anything else. After the cops left, my mom called my dad back and told him everything seemed okay. The next morning, however, when my mom was taking me and my brother to school, we were driving the opposite way which the truck had gone that night. Before we'd even traveled a mile, we saw something quite strange. There was a black cap along with a shirt and pair of pants lying on the side of the road. They looked as if they'd been taken off in quite a hurry. By the time we came home from school, the clothing was gone. Nothing ever showed up on the news, and the cops said they hadn't seen or heard anything about it either. It's been 15 years since this happened, and to this day I'm still left wondering what would have happened if my grandfather had agreed to let that shirtless man take a lift. This summer started off with a trip to a very prestigious university. It was basically nerd camp. Most people were actually very lovely, except for a handful of rather strange, sex-starved, or just plain socially awkward individuals. The types of people who would make random comments that would send chills down almost anyone's spine. For example, one boy made a comment about how we shouldn't have any qualms about secretly injecting people and the water supply with numerous biological chemicals as a means of testing what's suitable for biological warfare. Another bought a roll of 10,000 condoms and eagerly showed my roommate and I in a coffee shop with the biggest grin on his face, with everyone still around. One of my 3 roommates also had a peculiar habit of waking up in the wee hours of the morning, getting dressed, hopping back into bed, then darting out the door. The only real physical issues I had, though, were at the final dance. When the biochemical kids were introduced to the engineers, I hate to bag on them since most of my brother's friends, including his wife, are engineers, but all these kids were ridiculously creepy. I was followed the whole night by one kid who kept trying to teach me how to feel the beat of my veins in my wrist. That wasn't even the worst of it though. I have yet to introduce Brett. Brett was what my roommates and I described as the dictionary definition of a tall douchebag. Upon first impressions, he stuck out like a sore thumb amongst the sea of acne-ridden teens with oversized glasses and pants that were too big for their belts. He came from money, unlike most of us. He liked to let everyone know how superior he was to everyone because of this. He sat alone on all the bus rides, and until my roommates and I finally approached him, he only mingled with his fellow Pennsylvanians. He liked to brag about how long it would take him to get ready, and how he probably spent more time on his hair than any girl he knew. He was ridiculously good looking, and he knew it. On one particular bus ride, the two of us managed to be stuck together. His response was extremely rude. Man, I don't know if I could do this. I sat silently next to him as he scrolled through his Instagram pics. Glancing over, I saw him with another girl in formal attire, most likely for a dance or something. I saw this as an opportunity to initiate friendly small talk. I asked him if that was his girlfriend. He answered that no, it was one of his many dates. He started scrolling through Facebook pictures of him with other girls in fancy outfits. There were close to a dozen of them. To be honest, this kind of weirded me out. He also showed me pictures of him at concerts, parties, and other random places, all with a different girl by his side each time. Man, they're so dumb, he continued. I know they like me, but I just hate them all. I usually take them out when I'm bored. We get hammered, hook up, and that's it. I could never manage that. I can't even manage a hookup when I'm sober. I was past the point of being slightly uncomfortable. The way he spoke about these people was beyond messed up. He even described several hookups in very intricate details and referred to all the girls as though they were pieces of meat. Then the real crazy talk began though. I like to take these girls out to parties and get them super drunk. You know, I take care of them at first, help them to the bathroom, hold their hair back. When they throw up, I like to kick their feet out from under them and shove their face into their vomit. I like to spit on them too, and tell them I'm gonna kill them. You know, these girls, they're so dumb. If I hadn't been so shocked by the words he'd just said, I probably would have said something like, "What's wrong with you, you piece of shit?" All I could do, though, was respond with a stare equally as emotionless as his own. I guess he found that intriguing or something, maybe a little comforting, maybe even a little attractive, because the rest of his trip was always spent in my presence. He would often follow me around and bother me to talk about how different I was, how I wasn't like other girls, how I didn't give a fuck just like him. He would tell me all these stories about belittling and dehumanizing women, as though I was supposed to admire him. To be honest, I didn't say much in response, because how do you even respond to such a maniac? He got off on treating people like shit. We had the strangest level of friendship, because I fucking hated him, and at the same time, he was objectively attractive. He was superficially charismatic, and had a great sense of humor as well. There was something off about him. It was only because of all that he had disclosed with me that I was able to pick it up. His piercing blue eyes were always empty and cold whenever talking about personal topics or tragic events. He never missed a beat with a sympathetic reply, but I could tell it was disingenuous. I discussed the topic with my roommates, and we all came to a solid conclusion. Brett was a sociopath, possibly a narcissist, but definitely a sadist. No matter how attractive he was, we were gonna do our best to stay away from this fucking weirdo. After the camp ended and we'd successfully avoided him any further, I never thought I would see him again. He would simply be a creepy story to tell my friends around a campfire. However, that was not the case. My final trip of the summer, you better believe it was to accompany my best friend Pamela on her annual trip to visit her dad in Pennsylvania. Somewhere in these wooded forests, though, lurked a monster by the name of Brett. I had no intention of meeting up with him. but I did plan on meeting up with one of his friends. I didn't know it at the time, but I'd hit it off with one of his friends during the camp, sharing many of the same interests and hobbies. He told me before we left that if I were ever in Pennsylvania or DC, I should let him know, and he'd be more than happy to hang out with me. Although he and Brett did hang out every once in a while at camp, I didn't know they were friends back home. They were far too different. Drew was a freckled, paper-white ginger who was 5'10" and 135 pounds. He played video games and hiked for fun. Brett even told me specifically he hated Drew too. Apparently, he believed Drew was trying way too hard to be like him. That was most definitely untrue though. Drew was way too nice for that. Drew, Pamela, and I go hiking around his town. I didn't ask about Brett, but Drew mentioned him because of something we were talking about. My best friend was just dying to meet him after everything we'd told her. Drew said he could invite us to a party and we could all catch up a bit. We ended up going, since apparently Pamela thought spending the night making venison jerky wasn't a preferable alternative to meeting up with a crazed individual. Well, that party ended up being like something out of a nightmare. Raging college kids, a shit ton of drugs, all the stuff that would make me want to hide in a corner. Pamela was having a blast though, and so far I'd managed to avoid consuming any of the things Brett was trying to shove into my hand. He was following me the entire night, trying to pull me into him when we sat on couches, grazing my ass whenever I stood near him. At one point, he even tried to press me against the wall and kiss my neck. Not before his date came around though and got very pissy with him. I hid from him for the rest of the night. Eventually, the party began breaking up because someone got wind that the cops were coming. Drew was rushing me out to the car, but I couldn't find Pamela anywhere. I looked in the bathroom and found Pamela flipping her shit. She dragged me to the tub. There inside was a young woman. She was surrounded by vomit and water. Her face and lips were pale blue. Both of us began freaking out because she wasn't breathing. I called Drew and raced into the house. The three of us dragged her out to the front, performed CPR, and called an ambulance. Drew was pretty stoned, but he told us to wait in the car. He would explain everything to the cops, since he didn't want us to get in trouble too. The cops came and questioned everyone at the scene. The girl was taken away, and Pamela ended up having to call her dad to pick us up the next day. I called Drew up. He told me the girl was all right. He had also spoken with Brett, who seemed completely unfazed by everything. Apparently, she had passed out while they were fooling around in the basement, so he took the liberty of dumping her in the bathtub and turning on the faucet. He knew someone would find her eventually. He then split because he didn't want to get in any trouble. I know the world is pretty messed up and people can be downright evil, but to witness this firsthand was nauseating. Brett is only 19 years old, and it terrifies me to think about what he's capable of. Imagine in a few years. I truly hope I never have to look into his soulless eyes ever again. That's without a doubt the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. I've only told a few people this story, but I feel like I need to share it, just in case it helps any students abroad to be a bit more cautious. For a bit of background, this first happened to me about 5 years ago, when I was 19 and studying abroad in Italy. Our school had its own campus, about an hour outside of Rome. It was in a quiet town where the Pope even had a summer place. Part of our school program in Italy was that we'd leave campus for 10 days to vacation and explore Europe. In October, everyone would split off into their little friend groups and travel around. I didn't really have a group I was attached to, though. Obviously, I didn't want to go by myself either. I asked these two girls I was friendly with if I could join their traveling group. They were best friends and roommates. They were nice enough and said I could go with them. We decided to travel from Rome to Austria, Prague, and Germany, all via Euro-Rail. That's the train service in Europe. We went the entire trip having a lot of fun, not having any incidents at all, until the very last day, which is where my awful experience begins. On our last day, we were in Munich, meeting up with most of our class as a school tradition of sorts. The two girls I was traveling with and myself had tickets to take the overnight train that night to Rome. It left at around midnight. During the day, one of the girls told me she had changed her plans 10 days ago before we left and was going to stay in Munich overnight, then come back the next day. That was a surprise to me, but I wasn't that worried. She was still going to be joining up with our classmates and staying in a booked hostel with them. I would still be traveling with this other girl then. Much to my dismay, though, the other girl said she was changing her mind as well and was going to stay overnight with her friend. I asked her where she planned to stay then, as she hadn't booked a room like her friend did. She said she would sneak into the hostel and share a bed with the other girl. I told her I was really uncomfortable traveling alone. It wasn't fair for her to just abandon me like this. She told me very nonchalantly that I could simply find a hostel too, or book another ticket if I was so scared. I told her I didn't have the extra money to pay for a separate ticket back to Rome, let alone a hostel for the night. I was a broke college student on a very tight budget and had already spent quite a lot on this trip. I didn't have that much in my bank account. Despite my pleas and begging though, those petty girls essentially said I was no longer their problem and ditched me immediately. Luckily, we had already met up with another group of our classmates who felt quite bad for me. They spent the entire last day of our vacation running all around Munich, trying to find a hostel to stay that night. They even offered to pull together money to help me buy a ticket back at a different time. Unfortunately, it was Oktoberfest in Germany, and literally every hostel was completely booked up. Despite my attempts to sneak into my friend's hostel with them, I was stopped and thrown out. At this point, it was nighttime. I was defeated and worried. My other classmates who had tried to help me were still sticking with me at least. I figured at this point the only options I really had were to either sleep outside on a bench, totally unsafe and looking ridiculous, or take the overnight train to Rome all by myself. That wasn't super safe either, but I figured I'd be around other people, so maybe it wouldn't be completely awful. I decided to simply go ahead and take the overnight train back to Rome by myself. My classmates walked me to the station and saw me onto the train as well. Unsurprisingly, those kind people ended up being some of my closest friends in the years to come. Anyway, though, now I was on this overnight train by myself. I headed to my carriage, and the way it was set up was in a room off a hallway with 6 seats and no beds. I was trying to save money. I was the first one in my carriage, so I sat next to the window on one side. I pulled my giant backpacker's pack, which was my only luggage, right next to me. Eventually, 2 German guys in their 30s came in and were polite enough to sit opposite to me. They conversed with each other and got their suitcases out. They were looking at maps of Rome and tourist things to do. I felt safe enough with these guys. They were minding their own business. This is where things started to get bad, though. I settled in and started to listen to some music and try to rest for a little while. Perhaps after an hour or so, though, I noticed that there was a super sketchy man standing right outside our carriage in the middle of the hallway, staring through the window at me. I was completely freaked out, because no one is supposed to be in the hallway, just standing there. Either you're on your way to the loo or you're heading back to your own carriage. Why would you stand there blocking the path just staring in at someone? He wouldn't break eye contact with me once I looked at him either. He just kept staring at me with this sinister look on his face, like he wanted to eat me up right then and there. I tried to look away and pretend like I didn't really notice him. I waited a bit to see if he was just a normal guy, going to the loo or something. When I looked back, he was still there. He hadn't moved at all. I wanted to go shut the curtains so he couldn't look in at me, but I didn't want to get too close and piss him off or something. I turned to the 2 friendly-seeming German guys and quietly told them this guy there was creeping me out and staring in at me, making me feel very scared. I asked them if one of them could casually close the curtains for me. I hoped since they were men they could kind of protect me and tell the bugger off or whatever. They seemed annoyed and mumbled they would, but they never did so. I brought it up over again. They were obviously pissed at me, but eventually did close the curtain. I thought surely that would make the guy go away. I soon fell asleep. A few hours later, I woke to 3 young Germans in their mid to late 20s joining the carriage. The remaining 3 seats filled as they came in. As I looked out the door, though, I noticed the creepy guy from before was standing exactly where he had been right outside the door. I kind of freaked out inside. I tried to talk to the younger Germans, but they weren't very friendly either. Perhaps they didn't speak English very well. It had been hours at this point, and I noticed I really had to go to the bathroom. The loo was outside the carriage and down the hallway, at the very end of the train. When the younger Germans had come in, they moved the curtain a bit, so I could see the creepy man was still standing there leering at me. He refused to go away even hours later. I noticed that whenever someone walked by him, he just kind of acted casually, like he was waiting for someone or something, and looked away from me. But once they were gone, he went right back to staring at me. I tried to hold it in for as long as I could, but this was a 12-hour train ride. It would be another 4 hours or more before we made it to Rome, and there was no way I would be able to hold it in for that long. At this point, everyone in my carriage had been asleep for a long time, and I didn't want to wake anyone. I had to nudge the young Germans on my way out, though. I tried to tell them I was going to the bathroom. Could they maybe keep an eye on me and this creepy lurker? They brushed me off like I was a jerk for waking them up, and went right back to sleep. I exited the carriage, freaked out of my mind, and also about to pee my pants. I basically ran past the creepy dude standing outside. There was hardly any room in the hallway, and he was not giving me much space at all. He was just staring me down. I'm 5'4", and he was towering over me at like 6'2". I did my best to book it as fast as I could, and locked the door behind me. My heart was racing. I was going as fast as I could, so that hopefully he hadn't followed me there yet. Alas, once I got out, I saw he was right there, with the most disgusting smile on his face. I mean it. I don't want to exaggerate, but I could see evil in his eyes. I was sick to my stomach. I tried to squeeze by him, but he started to press himself against me, shoving me into the wall. I gave him the nastiest face, and yelled at him to let me go. There was another man heading to the loo as well just as he tried this. When the man saw us, the creepy dude moved off, and I booked it back to my carriage, where I proceeded to stay for the remainder of the ride. I had thought my outburst would have caused the guy to go away from me and not creep on me anymore, but when I looked up, he was right back there staring in at me. At this point, I was kind of in disbelief that someone could be so blatantly lecherous. I started to wonder if there was actually a seat out in the hallway or something. At this point, I remembered there were no detours or anything. This was a 12-hour trip from Germany to Rome, so everyone in this train was either coming or going from work, or a pleasure trip. All of them at least had a small suitcase of some kind, but this guy had no luggage at all on him. That made my stomach drop. Obviously, this man did not have good intentions, and I couldn't rationalize it in any way. I spent the last hours devising my plan for once the train finally arrived back in Rome. I knew the train station very well, and I already knew that the metro system I needed to transfer to get back to my campus was down several flights of steps. There were also more than a few twists and turns. I was pretty confident that when the train stopped, I would have my things ready. The other Germans got out of the train ahead of me. The creepy guy had to move for them to pass, so I quickly slipped in between them and jumped off the train. I booked it through the station without looking behind me. Thank God it was so crowded. I felt safe and disguised as I flew through the crowd and down the flights of stairs, around all the twists and turns without stopping. When I finally got to the platform for the metro station, I felt safe. I was catching my breath when I saw none other than the creepy man sprinting down the stairs. He began to look around for me. When he saw me, he got that evil, lecherous look in his eyes again. I wanted to cry. I grabbed tightly onto my pocket knife in my coat pocket and made my way over to a group of harmless-looking Italians. I tried to stand in with their group. They seemed annoyed I was standing so close to them. I was several train lengths away from him at this point, but he was starting to make his way over. When the train pulled up, I hopped into my car and immediately tried to position myself near some folks who kept rudely scooting away from me. He got on a few cars away. As the train started moving, he tried to make his way down to me. With each stop the train made, he got a little bit closer. I myself began to move further away as well. I grew increasingly worried that the further outside of the Metro Rome area we got, the fewer people would be on the train and the easier he could get to me. When I'd made it to the last car, I realized I had nowhere else to go. I looked around and noticed he was only one car away from me. He was heading my way as we pulled into the next stop. I grasped my pocket knife tightly and made a last-ditch effort to evade him. I got off the train, only to look at my right and see he'd jumped off as well and was now running toward me. As the last few people shoved past me to get on the train, I realized I had no other options. I threw myself back in without breaking eye contact. The second the doors of the train closed in front of him, I realized I'd made it safely. He was left on the platform, waiting for me and yelling as the train sped off. Not really believing I'd actually made it, I spent the rest of the metro ride still in fight or flight mode and dashed upstairs to my above-ground bus, up to my campus, making sure I was sitting next to a sweet old lady. The creeper dude never showed up on the bus, and once I made it back inside my campus walls, I fell immediately to the ground and cried. I realized I was so incredibly lucky. I had evaded what was probably most certainly a kidnapping, a murder, or something else. I've never forgotten that man's face, and the look in his eyes, how it made me feel. I wanted to peel my skin off and crawl under a rock and die. I ended up telling of my ordeal to the dean of our campus and pleaded for him to reprimand those two girls who'd abandoned me and forced me into a compromising position which was totally unsafe. I wanted the dean to tell all students and future students it's never okay to let someone travel alone, especially since most of us were young and plain naive and stupid. We didn't know what safe was, not in a foreign country. That weasel of a dean thought I was overreacting though, and that I'd been asking for it. Yeah, it was a school that victim blamed me. I haven't heard of anyone else in my school getting into a situation like me, but I've made sure to tell all the girls and guys who are in my year and below to be careful when they study abroad and not do what those girls did to me. I hope it helps someone in some way, and if you ever see a man traveling alone on a long-distance train with no luggage or briefcase at all, always be wary. As a humanist, I try to look for opportunities to help my fellow human beings to live a life of kindness and compassion. Hopefully, I'll leave the world a little nicer than when I found it. There's a thin line, though, between kindness and naivete. I learned this the hard way 3 or 4 years ago. I was 24 years old. I'm a female and recently single, living happily alone. I left work at around 3 a.m., the joys of the service industry. I happened to give a ride home to a coworker who closed with me. It wasn't a bad part of town per se, but also not the greatest either. Whatever, time to head home and get me some sleep. I was patiently waiting at the red light, street devoid of cars and people. It's 3 a.m., so of course there was nobody out here. That was when I noticed a man and a woman stumbling down the sidewalk to my right. The man walked over and knocked on my car window. I flinched. My car doesn't have electronic anything, and my window was already down an inch. Maybe they needed help or something. Why else would they be staggering about at 3 a.m.? They said her ankle was broken and she couldn't walk properly. The lady was just kind of swaying just out of view, moaning in either pain or inebriation. I frowned. "I can call someone for you if you'd like," There's a gas station right over there. Maybe you could—" The guy interrupted me by opening my front passenger door, which my coworker hadn't locked. The woman stranger stepped into my car. It happened so fast I was completely stunned, even more so when the guy squeezed in beside her. 2 people now sitting in the front seat of my Toyota Corolla. I was suddenly conscious of the woman's leg pressing against my purse at her feet. Inside was my phone, my Kindle, and my wallet. With all the hard-earned money I'd made in the past 2 weeks of waiting tables, that was my rent. They both reeked of alcohol, and their eyes were glazed over, obviously high as hell. The guy told me to drive them to the Kruger up the street. I just started driving. I complied. If they were armed, I didn't want to find out. The guy was drinking something straight out of a bottle in a brown paper bag. What a class act. What would they do if I refused? They were clearly in a mentally altered state, unpredictable and dangerous. I pressed my lips into a forced smile and tried to be as calm and polite as possible. Maybe they'd have second thoughts about murdering me if I was nice to them, or at least feel a little bit bad about it. They tried to engage me in conversation as we drove. The woman seemed to be about 40-something. Her skin was quite leathery. She would rattle off schizophrenic nonsense constantly one minute, then become incredibly lucid and well-spoken the next minute, talking about complex topics like computer science. Watching her flip back and forth between these 2 states of mind was completely surreal. She told me I didn't need to be so scared. They weren't going to hurt me. All they needed was a ride. I smiled and nodded. The man seemed much older than she was, in his 60s, maybe her uncle or father. He would only speak by giving turn-by-turn directions and would absolutely lose his shit at me if I so much as looked at the girl. Unexpectedly, the neighborhood deteriorated around us. I desperately scanned the roads for a police car on patrol. I would call attention to myself somehow, run a red light, honk, swerve at them, anything. Then I would be saved. There was no such luck, however. My passengers were becoming increasingly agitated and paranoid as we neared our destination. They could sense my fear, I guess, because the woman began to play with my hair and stroke my cheek. "Hey, don't be scared. I already said we're not gonna hurt you. You're such a nice girl." She cooed and continued to caress my hair. "You're so nice. Such a pretty girl." The man chuckled. I saw the Kruger across the street. They screamed at me to take a left turn, though, into the sketchiest apartment complex I'd ever seen. My heart sank. I thought this is how it was going to end. The guy got out, though, and said he would be right back. And to make sure the girl didn't get out, they had more stops to make after this one. Ah, hell no. The woman stayed with me in the car, and the guy disappeared into one of the units. This was obviously a drug deal. I idly wondered if I'd be guilty of a crime now, an accessory to something. I also wondered if they were going to try and force me to come to a party with them later or some shit. Not gonna happen. I knew that if I got out of my car, that would be the beginning of the end. Once the man was completely out of sight, the woman spread out the passenger seat. I thought she was making herself comfortable, until her legs parted suggestively, and she began sexy slow dancing in my 2008 Toyota Corolla. She looked at me with the most lustful set of bedroom eyes. She asked me if I liked what I saw. Is this really happening? Was this random woman propositioning me while dancing to Evanescence in my car, as if this night couldn't get any more bizarre? I suppressed any reaction and gave an apologetic smile. "Oh, thank you, but I don't swing that way." I hastily switched one of my everyday rings to my wedding finger and held it up with a regretful smile. "I'm married, you see. My husband is expecting me home soon." Her demeanor dropped like a curtain, her face twisting with fury. "What do you think I am, some kind of hooker?" "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean it like that." "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't think at all." "Sorry, I'm just very tired. I worked all day long." She stared at me, eyes wide and struggling to focus. She broke into another wide, manic smile and slumped back into her chair. There was an uncomfortable silence here. I had to do something. No way was I going to see how this night played out with me and the two of them. My eyes darted to the unit the man went into, and I leaned over to the woman, my face a mask of concern. "Hey, your guy's been gone an awfully long time. Don't you think you should go and check on him? Make sure he's okay?" Her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "You won't just drive away?" I did my best angelic voice I could muster. "Of course not, I promise." Imagine my surprise when this actually worked. I watched her get out of the car and close the door. Immediately I booked it, rubber screeching and heart pounding. It was dark, so I didn't bother looking back. I tried to leave the complex, but there was only one exit, the way we came in, which also happened to be right next to where I dropped them off. I pulled into a random parking spot several buildings away, turned off my car, and ducked into my seat. I should have called the police then and there, but I didn't think I was out of the woods just yet. I was safe-ish. I called a friend and broke down in tears, explaining everything over the phone. Once the adrenaline had worn off, I started my car back up, with no sign of anyone watching the gate or looking for me. I made a getaway and arrived home safely, about a half hour later. I called the police, and an officer was sent over to take my statement. I didn't expect anything to come of it, of course, but I wanted the event on record, just in case there was retaliation. They knew where I worked because of my uniform, which also had my name prominently displayed. The officer asked me where I ended up taking them, and from my vague description, he instantly knew the location. A high-crime area with lots of drug-related incidents. Great. I still drive that 2008 Corolla. My next car will have electric locks, though.